Hello, and welcome to the Royal Automobile Club on Pall Mall for this talk show in association with Motorsport. Joining me today is Sam Canal, our staff writer at Motorsport. I'm Jack, the digital editor, and we are with a man who's driven just about everything and everywhere, I think, David Hobbs. So welcome.
Welcome to you as well.
So thanks for coming all this way from Florida. So
no trouble at all, just a few thousand miles or so between friends.
And you're here to promote your book, Hobbo.
I am indeed, published by Evro over here in the UK. And now that was a long book. I did the Le Mans 24-hour race 20 times. But that was nothing compared to doing this book. My wife has been thinking I should be writing a book for many years. And so I thought about it for about 20 years. And then it took about 10 years to actually get it finished.
Right.
And myself and Andrew Marriott finished it off. But I actually started with one of my co-commentators from the American TV, Bob Varsha. And we started that literally about 10 years ago. So. But I must say, it looks a lovely book now.
It definitely does. Like I say, it's long, it's thick.
Yes.
And lots of personal photographs in there as well. How was that? Difficult, easy, enjoyable, going through those?
Well, no, it was fine. Good fun looking up at those old photographs and seeing them all again. Unfortunately, we've moved twice in the last few years. We moved from England to America in 2002. We've moved completely. We had actually moved in like 1990, but and then we've moved house in America. So pictures kind of got photos and things, and I was a hopeless filer. Filing is not my big thing, and so stuff got separated, scattered around in storage. So it took quite a long time to find my photos. Andrew Marriott had some photographs, and then of course we went to people like LAT and the Rev Institute for the rest.
Yep. One thing that always surprises me when I look at these sort of books, with the same with Brian Redman's book, I think he lives quite close to you.
I think I've heard of him.
Yeah. I think. How do you guys remember all of these stories to the day of these stories? I can't remember what I had for breakfast. So.
Well, everybody says I've got a good memory, but actually my memory is dreadful. A lot of it was Andrew himself looked up a lot of stuff. He's a good researcher. I'm not a good researcher. I'm not a good researcher. I'm not a good filer. But I do tell good stories when I visit things like car clubs like Porsche and BMW, Ferrari in the States. And they're also a big catalyst of the book. A lot of them say, why don't you write it? When are you going to write a book? When are you going to write a book? So some of those things I can remember very clearly. Right. But there's a tremendous amount of stuff I just can't remember at all. And I apparently drove an LM Ferrari in something like 6 or 7 events. I remember 2 of them. Other than that, I can't remember anything at all. Wow. So, but it has worked out pretty well. And as I say, when I had trouble, Andrew came to rescue very well, and found a lot of stuff, researched results, looked up all my results, which I never thought of doing myself. Right. And certainly not enough firsts in there for my liking.
So talking of firsts, a Morris Oxford, not the obvious choice.
Well, my whole racing career was not an obvious choice because my mother and father weren't the least bit interested in racing, although I was very interested in Sterling Moss when I was a kid. And Jimmy Clark, when he started to come on the scene, impressed the hell out of me. But I did like going fast, and I had a Lambretta scooter for my 16th birthday. And I drove that absolutely flat out and wore the whole foot thing off, And so I then swapped that in and bought a 5-year-old Triumph Speed Twin, which was much quicker. And me and my girlfriend at the time, Margaret, Mags, who was still married after all these years, we used to hare around the Warwickshire countryside. So then I really thought seriously about racing the bike. Then I had second thoughts about that. But Dad was an inventor, and he had a very small factory in Leamington Spa, where he invented an automatic transmission, which was it was the best automatic transmission of its day. It had 4 speeds, didn't have a fluid drive, it had a friction clutch, so it didn't have much power loss, negligible power loss. It was a bit heavier than a regular 4-speed. and he was doing experimentation, and a tremendous amount of people had prototypes. BMC, Midland Red buses, a train company had one on a shunt locomotive, cement trucks, just about everything you could think of, BMW, Fiat, all had prototypes. And luckily for me, Mum's car was the old MO Morris Oxford, which was a side valve.
Right.
So it wasn't exactly endowed with a lot of horsepower. And I was an apprentice at Daimler, and then I became an apprentice at Jaguar, because Jaguar took Daimler over while I was still there. And the old man had it up at his factory, had a B series engine, overhead valve B series engine, a BMC B series engine. So with the help of the mechanics at the shop, we were able to change from the side valve, so at least I had an overhead valve. And I went to the Parkside garage in Coventry, which is the big BMC dealership, and I bought an MGA manifold,
right,
and put that on, and then I got 2 SU carburetors from Daimler. I don't think I paid for them. I got 2 SU carburetors from Daimler and modified it. And then the old boy at the pipe bender, Daimler, of course, was a very old factory. And they had this workshop which was unbelievably full of smoke, and it was where they used to balance the fluid flywheels.
Right.
They put hot wax in them, and you skimmed it off till it was level with the vanes. And then you'd balance it, and you'd drill little plugs to put lead in, just like wheel weights on a tyre. And this old boy, he made exhaust pipes for about every Daimler that was ever made. So all through this shop were all these coke braziers glowing away all day, and he'd have exhaust piping in there, and he'd bend the pipe. So I thought it'd be a good idea if old Bill made me a racing manifold. So we made a manifold, which actually miraculously fitted. So I had a really raughty car, made a lot of noise, which was very important. I don't know what Mum thought when she was going downtown on it. Not much, probably, but anyway, that was my first race car.
It was stayed on while she was driving it around the roads.
Yeah. Well, I had no alternative. I could, it wasn't like a proper store-bought exhaust manifold. I mean, it was once it was on, it was on. I mean, you can't. So, anyway, and that was my first race car. Yeah, I drove it to Snetterton.
And there was something about that era. Brian Redman, I think, had a supercharged Minor. These days, we have Ginettas and we have little Formula Ford single-seaters. It's difficult to imagine now a young driver driving around in a Morris Oxford. Or I think the closest thing we've got is Nick Tandy, maybe, who started in minis and has reached the top. I think that's a shame now, isn't it?
Well, it's changed so much, really. I mean, the whole aspect of club racing. You go to the SCCA club racing in America, which is where it all starts for road races. And I mean, every car there is brought in a covered trailer, with benches, and you wheel the car out, and now you got a full-scale workshop right there with you at the track.
Yep.
And it's got racing tires, racing wheels, and it's a highly modified whatever it is. And in my day, I just drove to the track in the car.
Yep.
And hopefully drove home. Of course, needless to say, I didn't drive home from my first race, but and that's what club racing was all about. I mean, when I got to the track, of course, the organizer said, "Oh my God, a Morris Oxford with an automatic transmission. This is not homologated. You'll have to go in the sports car race." So I'm suddenly in with the likes of people like Sir John Whitmore and his Lotus Elite, and XK120s, and of course, obviously, needless to say, where I qualified, and I didn't last long either. But that was real club racing. Most of those cars in that race were driven there, and there was a sign writer there who would put a number on.
Excellent.
Because you had different numbers every race, and he'd go down by the door, put a big 9, or a big 1-8 or whatever. Then you'd wash it off, because I didn't wash it off, because I'd like to go home with the racing number on. And they all the same. You arrived, they painted the number on your car, and off you went. So club racing has changed enormously, and as you say, Brian, his first car was he drove a Morris Minor, not a mini Minor, a Minor Woody, the station wagon, which is what he used every day to sell mops and buckets for his dad's, chain of shops. Yeah. So, pretty different now. And as I say, now you go to a club race and everything there is trailered in, well prepared, got a mechanic. I mean, me and a couple of friends, I mean, we did everything. And a mechanic, even though I did a 5-year apprenticeship at Daimler, a mechanic I'm not. And so it is very different. And it is a shame. I mean, the other thing, I suppose I was luckier than most kids because I had access to a car, access to an engine, and I was an apprentice, so I had access to bits and pieces at the factory, and we had a workshop and a pit, so to change the engine wasn't the last thing in the world. But no question of actually buying a car to go racing. I mean, this had to be used. It had to be a multi-use car. Couldn't just have a race car.
Yep.
Couldn't done that.
But that's also what's difficult to imagine, that your own mother lending you her car to go racing. I don't think I'd be able to do that. I know it's a hybrid, but still.
Well, I don't think she realised I don't think she realised she was letting me. She knew I'd done something to it because of the row it made. But I mean, well, we did have, because these were demonstrators, which Dad had, we got these cars. No, I wouldn't say we had lots of cars lying around, but we had a green Morris Hospital and we had a red Morris Hospital. And these were basically prototype gearbox, demonstrators and test cars. Because, I mean, Dad was permanently testing and changing things on the gearbox to try and perfect it. So we did have transport available, which I guess did make me lucky. But the other cost, of course, I mean, you had to be a member of a club, because they were all club races, and you had to be a member of the Knocking Sports Car Club or the BARC or the BRSCC or whatever. And then they all asked each other to their events, so you just got to be a member of one. Yep, sure. You had to join the RAC to get your license. And the license was like £5. Entry fee was about, £2.10 in old money. Yep. And the fuel was, half a crown a gallon. So it was not a big expensive thing. When my grandson was go-kart racing in America, like 10 years ago now, I mean, the entry fee for a go-kart weekend was like, $300.
Yeah.
And the entry fee for my first race was like £5.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, it's just, those costs have, obviously the cost of living's gone up over the years. We know that inflation has taken. But I think the costs of racing have escalated way above inflation.
Karting budgets are hundreds of thousands now, which is just unthinkable.
Yeah. Well, of course, you got kids. I mean, obviously go-karting wasn't the big thing then. I mean, it wasn't like everybody went go-karting like they do now. You've got to be a go-kart, then you're a county champion, you're the state champion, the world champion, you're like someone like Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, all these guys come from go-kart. In my day, everybody started off like I did, just racing a car. Any car you could get your hands on, and if you could race it, you raced it.
Yeah. And then from there, you went to a TV shunt at Alton Park.
Well, after Morris, I'd got the taste for it because I was a bit dumb. Well, I was a bit dumb. I am a bit dumb. I'm just generally not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I raced the Morris on Michelin X, and I raced Dad's Jag on Michelin X. Now, I didn't modify his Jag because he had an XK140 with the C-type head, so it already had the 3 carburetors on it. And I went to Alton Park to spring meeting, which all I could think about at tech and at work was that I was going to race this Jag. Well, it still had the Michelin X on, and on the last lap going into Old Hall, it got away from me, and because there was no guardrail, in those days you had a bit of a runoff, and then an earth bank, and it sort of went up the bank and flopped over on its roof. And apparently my dad saw this on the TV, because there wasn't much TV on racing then, but he'd already seen it. So I rang to tell him, and he said, yes, I know, I've already seen it. And then the worst damage done to the car was Mags and I set off for home from Alton Park.
The same crashed Jag. Huh? The same crashed Jag.
Same crashed Jag. I mean, we saw, I don't know what we did. The roof, it was a drop top. And the worst thing that happened was on the way home, the bonnet opened. And of course, those XK120s had a bonnet about the same length as his table. I mean, bloody great bonnet. And it opened and flopped over the top of the windscreen. somehow we got it tied down. I don't know, found a bit of string or something, and got home. But that did more damage to that bonnet than anything. And then Dad said, well, you broke it, you fix it. And I was a Jaguar apprentice by now. And the guy that worked in the paint shop, well, in the body shop, he said he'd do it for me at his house in Daventry. Right. And he just lived in a little count's house or a little garage at the end of his garden. So he bashed out the bodywork in there, and I think I might have had to buy a new bonnet. Right. But he bashed all the other dents out, and then of course he resprayed it. Well, unfortunately, he had to respray it after he got home from work, which was, by the time he got back to Daventry from Coventry, it was probably about 6 o'clock. So it had started to damp. The air had gone damp like it does at night. So this car came out a nice, the same blue as it was, but it came out with a matte finish. So it was matte to the end of its life. And now I did modify that car quite a bit, and I finally got my head together and I went over to Dunlop and bought some Dunlop racing tyres, which Dunlop were really good then. I can see the face of the young guy who was the competition manager. Terrifically helpful young man, and of course they gave all us club racers a huge discount. This is a tyre that would normally cost you like 50 quid in those days, and we'll sell it you for 12 or whatever. And so I put racing tyres on it. I got a straight through exhaust system, right, and I put disc brakes on it because it was a drum brake car. Put disc brakes on it. Put a anti-tramp bracket on the rear axle. Because this also had Dad's automatic gearbox. And I actually won some races in that car. It was pretty effective when I'd finished modifying it.
And the automatic gearbox got quite a lot of attention from, I think, was it Ford or other manufacturers wanted to use it?
Well, it was all very sad in the end. I mean, because it worked like a charm in that Jag. And there's a big picture of me in Motorsport magazine, two-pedal racer, and it was at Woodcote going through Madrick. Right. In a nice drift, even though I say it myself. It looked very well positioned on the road, I thought. But so I did have some success in that car, and it was Dad's gearbox had 4 speeds. It had a beautiful little gear train. It had a friction clutch which was hydraulically operated, and when you're in top gear, you had 2 clutches, and when you're in top gear, both clutches were engaged, and obviously everything else just spun as one. And it had full manual override, so if you put it in 4th, it was then automatic, just on its own. But you could also override it by going down to 3rd, 2nd, 1st. And there were little holes in these little valves that so you couldn't do it accidentally, you couldn't just put it in 1st. Right. But in my case, they drilled those out a bit, so if I wanted to go down earlier than you would normally expect, I could do it. So, and it was like a sequential shift. I mean, it's just like 1, 2, 3, 4, leave it in 4th, and everything would do itself. And then to start, instead of dropping the clutch, like rev it to like 2,000, 5,000, or whatever the engine was revving to. I think that Jag engine only revved to about 5.5. Anyway, you'd rev it to like 2, and then I'd just stick it in 1st. Like everybody else dropping the clutch, the clutch would slip a little bit, which is what you wanted to do. But of course it made the axle tramp horribly, which is what I put these brackets on to stop it doing that. And then I'd just go up and down the gears in a sequential way. So it was a very quick change. The only disadvantage was it's slightly heavier than the standard box. The power loss was negligible. And it did quite well. And at that stage, Westinghouse Brake and Signal bought an interest in Dad's company because they were very, very, very close to doing a deal with Ford. I mean, we had hundreds of Corsair. Do you remember the Corsair?
Yep.
And early Cortinas.
I know of it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think they were around when you were around. And Ford had given them to all their local dealer managers. And these guys just loved Gearbox. Right. And the dealers liked it because the smallest Ford you could get with an automatic was a Zephyr. Right. Which was 2.5 litre, 6. But they were terrible slugs because they were slush boxes. You know, they had a fluid drive, which soaked up enormous amounts of power. And everybody loved the fact that this didn't take any power, and you could have it on a small car. We had lots running around in Ford Anglias, which are only 1,000 cc. So even the old man thought it'd be a good idea maybe to use the gearbox. So he bought an Elite.
Yes.
So we had a Lotus Elite for 1961, and
went straight to Le Mans as well.
Not in that car. With that car, we started off and we hadn't taken any of the trim out, so it was a bit on the heavy side. And then a guy called Henry Lee, who had been a mechanic, who had worked at Lotus, he saw me race at Mallory Park, and he said, "Well, you guys need a bit of help." But he said, "No, I'd like to help because I think that you could have a good deal with this car." So anyway, Henry came on board, and I had a chap called Ben Cox, who was a friend of mine, who also did some mechanicking on the car, and we had our mechanic from the dealership. He worked there all. He just worked there through the day and didn't help out at weekends. And that car became very successful. We took the weight out. Henry resprung it to take, took the weight out and things up here. We loaded it back to where it should be. We didn't do any trick like get Barani wire wheels, which is what I always wanted, a little bit wider, give you a bit more grip, but we couldn't. We didn't want to go that sort of length. And we started. I can't remember where we came in the first few races, but we finally won at Brands Hatch, which would have been in probably April. And I beat Love One, which is Graham Warner's, the grey and white car.
Yep.
And I beat Dad 10, which is Les Leston. And the next week was the Nürburgring 1,000 Ks, and we decided to push the boat out and do the Nürburgring. So we get the car in the trailer and flew over on the. Do you remember those old what are they called, Silver City or something, which was a air transport. Got to Calais, and then of course a friend, "No, you haven't got a carnet, or we haven't got something." Anyway, we got to Nürburgring, and hey presto, we're in that old paddock there, which is like a sort of it was a cobblestone.
Right.
The paddock, great. It's just like an old stable block.
Courtyard, yeah.
Yeah, it was very impressive.
Yeah.
And about every 5 minutes there'd be Acton Faralaga, and there'd be something which is a tension paddock, and then it was suddenly we had this Acton Faralaga. "Herr Hobbs, will you come to the office, please?" At once. So, Christ, now what? So we go off to the office, and the guy says, "We have had a complaint from one of your competitors. Your car is not homologated with an automatic gearbox. So we're going to move you from the up to 1100cc GT class to the up to 1600cc sports car class."
Right.
In which, of course, we had absolutely no hope at all. And I was driving with Bill Pinkney, who was a friend of mine, who was racing a Lotus 11 at the time, and he was very quick. And he and I asked him to drive. So anyway, off we went. And we both drove very well, and on the last lap, because we were racing against those Porsche RSRs, which are pretty hot cars.
Yep.
Sterling was driving one, I think, and Joe Bonnier and people like that. And on the last lap, the only one left spun into the ditch, and we won the class. Now, the Germans, being very thorough people, their prize structure was very formal. Obviously, the biggest, fastest cars got the most money. Well, the 1600cc sports car was about 6 classes above the 1100cc GT class, and we got about 6 times the money.
Excellent.
So that was great. Perfect. And so that was our first major international win with the gearbox. Yeah. And when we took it apart back at the factory, you could still read the Mintex on the clutch lining, and so it was a very successful foray.
And then Colin Chapman was so impressed they gave it to Jim Clark.
At the end of that year, I finished my apprenticeship. I'm now at Jag, and Lofty England, of course, is my boss.
Yep.
So I'm often racing Lofty England to work in the morning, because we both lived in Leamington, and I'm on my motorbike, and he was in an early E-type.
Right.
The only trouble was, I was supposed to be there an hour earlier than him, but anyway, it's sort of beside the point. But he was a big fan of mine. I was a terrible apprentice, absolutely terrible. And because my mind was totally into racing now, and I had the elite, and I just was a hopeless apprentice. But Lofty was a big fan of mine. He helped me a lot, and he he didn't think much of the sort of look of the Jag, but he was impressed by his performance.
Right.
And he was the clerk of the course at Silverstone for a club race on the old club circuit.
Yep.
We went to Beckett's and then straight down the main runway. And I had a terrific race with a DB4. Of course, the DB4 was brand new, and my Jag by this time was like 10 years old. It was a 19... No, it wasn't 10 years old. It was only 7 years old. It was a 55. So anyway, I beat this guy. You know, we passed and repassed. And Lofty was impressed with that. And he, at the end of my apprenticeship, he got me a deal to drive for Peter Berry, who had an E-Type and a 3.8 Mark II, which I was absolutely just lusting to drive these cars. And I came down here to London on the Marylebone Road, went to Castrol, signed a contract for 500 quid, which was a lot then, and to drive for Peter Berry. And our very first race was in the E-Type, was at Daytona, and that was at the inaugural 3-hour, the Continental 3-hour, which Bill France was very keen to put on.
Which became the 24.
Which became the Rolex 24.
Yeah.
And I took part in the very first one of those in 1962. So at the end of 61, I finished my apprenticeship, signed with Peter Berry, signed with Castrol, got married on December the 16th, and had a professional drive to go to. And, of course, was now working for Dad as well at the factory. So off I went to Florida with the Jag. But previously, back at the end of the season, like in sort of October, Colin Chapman had called and said, look, you know, I'm interested in that automatic gearbox. Could we borrow the car for Jimmy Clark to drive in this 3-hour race coming up in Daytona? Well, of course, it's just perfect. So Jimmy and I and Peter Berry all flew over together. Of course, in those days, we had to fly to New York. You couldn't fly to Florida.
Right.
And we had to drive down there. And Briggs Cunningham, a guy who used to work for Briggs Cunningham, his name, I just can't remember off the top of my head. He organised all the transportation of both cars and getting them down to Daytona, and they lent us a car to drive down because there was no I-95. It was down one, what's now US 1. So there's towns and traffic lights, and we got stopped for speeding about 8 times between New York and Daytona. And then Jimmy Clark and I shared a room at the Carousel Motel in Daytona. And he drove the Elite and I drove the Jag. Unfortunately, the Jag only lasted about 16 laps. The fuel pump broke. And Jimmy was leading the class in my Elite by absolutely miles. And he stopped for his one and only fuel stop, and the boxy thing wouldn't start. The starter motor got fried up, and it wouldn't start. So, but, you know, to cut a very long story short, as you know, Colin Chapman was a very innovative designer. Certainly led the field in his. I mean, he'd certainly be the Adrian Newey of back then. And he thought, you know, that automatic works well, because Jimmy Clark had us put one in his own personal Elite for road use, and Sterling Moss had one put in his Elite for road use, because Jimmy in those days used to live up in Duns in Berwickshire, and of course no M1 either. So it was a long drive from Berwick to Lotus down in London in those days, East London. And he loved it. And Dad's company finally went bust at the end of 1963, and we had already built a prototype Formula One gearbox for Colin. Right. It was just lying there on the floor of the shop when it all shut down. So Colin was well ahead of the game there, because he could see that automatic was a terrific way to go for a race car.
Yeah.
You did speak about the kind of financial burden that put on you at the time when your dad's gearbox company went bust, and it's interesting to see how much money it actually took to race and keep everything else alive. And you were working for him at the time as well. That must have been quite difficult.
Well, we were married. We bought our first house. We had our first baby, Greg, and I'd worked for Dad, and I was making about £900 a year for Dad, and then I went professional basically in 1963. I was racing my elite. I was racing any car I could get my hands on, and I was employed by a Midland Racing Partnership, which is Richard Atwood and myself.
Yep.
And I drove David Baker's car, Bill Bradley, me, Richard Atwood were the three drivers. And they paid me, and I made about £900 racing. So Margaret and I had a big discussion at the end of '63 when Dad went bankrupt. Well, he shut the firm down. And should I turn professional? What do you think? I'm going to make about 900 working, about 900 racing. Maybe I could make a bit more racing if I did more races. And so for '64, I turned pro. And the reason Dad's company failed was that Ford, at the very, very last minute, Westinghouse Brake and Signal had bought an interest in the company. And they actually had built a factory in Manchester to make 500 of these units a day for Ford. And then at the last minute, it all fell through. And what the hell happened, I don't know. But there must have been a lot of muttering in the boardrooms of Detroit. People like Borg Warner and other big automatic transmission companies were obviously pretty impressed with the Allmans gearbox. And then Ford, anyway, it didn't get used. And so, and then he had done, we were doing a lot of prototype work for Borgward in Germany. And they were very keen on it. They were tremendously keen on it. And then they went bust. So that didn't come about. And of course, the whole train of disappointments had started back, 4 years before that, because Daimler and Lanchester had introduced at the motor show in 1955 a Lanchester Sprite, which was a small Lanchester monocoque construction, very advanced for its day, 1.5 litre 4-cylinder engine, and an automatic gearbox. And this was the Lanchester for the masses, and Lanchester had always been a slightly upmarket car like Daimler. And of course, at the last minute, BSA went under, and so he missed out 2 really golden opportunities, Lanchester with the Sprite and Borgward was the Isabella when both those companies went under. So it was I don't know how the old man lasted. The disappointment must have been just absolutely palpable, and but he did. And so at the end of '63, Margaret and I got a big decision to do. What are we going to do? Am I going to go back to Jag and work there, as an engineer or what? So we decided to do the all what and go racing. And
things moved pretty quickly. By '65, you were about to make your Formula One debut. If it wasn't for the journey down.
Once again, it didn't seem to end too well.
No. We were on holiday at a place called Clay in East Anglia.
Yep.
And I'd spoken to Tim Parnell. They wanted me to drive his Formula One car in the French Grand Prix at Clermont. But there again, talking about the difference between then and now. I mean, the first thing I had to do was I had to go to Heston, which is where Hounslow, Heston, wherever he was, and pick the race car up in my car and tow it down on a 2-wheel trailer. I lived in Warwick, and so we set off, and a friend of mine, Jack Brown, was going to come along, who had been an apprentice with me at Jag. And so I put my seatbelt on, and because nobody wore seatbelts in those days. But having been in racing, I decided that seatbelts actually weren't a bad idea. And Jack said, "Do you put it on?" I said, "You're going to put yours on, so I better put mine on." And then we were running down the A40, I suppose, between Bicester and Aylesbury, and coming the other way was a truck, a 5-ton laundry truck, and it turned right into a factory across the road. And it stopped in the middle of the road and waited. So I'm assuming he's waiting for us. Anyway, at the last minute, he lumbered off. And I mean, we hit the side of that van. Of course, we were doing about 90. We weren't doing 90 when we hit, but it really tanked this Cortina. And even with the belt, I hit my head on the steering wheel, and I broke my nose and my cheeks and my jaw and my arm, my left arm. And so I was in hospital for, about 2 weeks at down at Aylesbury. Of course, poor old Margaret's waiting for me to get killed in a car accident, in a racing accident. She wasn't thinking about car accident.
How did you get word to the team?
Pardon?
How did word get to the team?
Honestly, I can't remember. And the amazing is that Jack Brown, his side, the dashboard all got pushed right back. And when I went to look at the wreck after I'd been come out of hospital, there was absolutely no gap between the dash and his seat at all. How his legs didn't get hurt or anything, I can't imagine. So I don't know how the team got told, but at that time, that was the least of my worries.
Yeah.
In '65, I was driving that Lola T70 for Harold Young Limited in East Anglia, and I came out of hospital, and about 4 or 5 weeks later, we went to Croft, and I won the race on my return to racing. So that was pretty satisfying, and but it was very disappointing. I missed my first Formula 1 race. Yeah.
But then a year later, you were with John Wyer, and looking at the people you drove for, you've got Broadley, Parnell, Wyer, Penske, Yost, Alexander and Mayer at McLaren. That's some of the biggest names.
Never heard of any of them.
How do they all compare? Who was the easiest, hardest?
Oh, wow. Well, all those good guys are pretty easy to drive for because you've got really good equipment. But they all have very high expectations.
Yep.
And you have high expectations of them. The Wire car, which I drove in '68 and '69, was probably my first really big. I had driven for Eric Broadley and done some testing for Eric. And Eric was very easy to work for, slightly eccentric. A bit like, I don't know about Adrian, not very eccentric, I don't think, but Eric, you go to a test day and you'd suddenly realize you got one black and one brown shoe on. And you'd say, Eric, oh yeah, so I have, didn't notice that. And Eric was very far out. He'd have, everybody just had a clipboard and stopwatch and a pencil.
Yeah.
And he'd come in and say, well, it's understeering a bit now after we'd done that last change. And it pushes us quite a bit at stow. And because in those days, the driver was the data.
Yeah.
There was no other data collection at all, period. So it was entirely up to the driver. So he'd watch the revs going into and coming out of the corners and, and he had to remember everything. He'd say, it's pushing a bit, Eric, as he goes through stone. He'd look at the sky and tap his teeth with his pencil and say, you sure? Say, yep. Why don't you go and just try it again? Driving for Wire, John Wyer was Paul Hawkins, who drove with me in '68, called him Death Ray because he was very white and very, he was not a people person, but obviously very, very good at running long distance cars.
Yeah.
And the whole team were good. People like David York, who was the team manager, and John Horseman, who was the chief engineer. They were all very good, very experienced, and it was a great team to drive for. Roger Penske, well, you couldn't get anybody better than Roger because in those days we were about the same age. Well, he's about 2 years older than me, so he was only just a little bit older than me. And already he had a huge reputation just in a very few years because obviously he'd been a very successful driver himself. But then, like a lot of businessmen, he'd realised, there's much more money to be made in business than there is in racing at my level sort of thing. So, and of course, he's certainly right. He employs something like 38,000 people worldwide now. And I saw Roger just on last Friday at Sebring. We went to a Hall of Fame do there, and he and I are chatting outside, and Dindo Capello was given the Hall of Fame. So he and Roger are talking outside, and I'm standing there talking to them. And Dindo is, very proud of his Audi dealership in Bologna, which he's got, after many years of good service. And he's talking to Roger. Roger says, yeah, well, I got the Mercedes and the BMW and something else dealership in Bologna. Yeah, nice town, isn't it? So Dinda called, you know. So.
Did it feel like you were driving more for Mark Donahue, though?
Well, Mark was very taciturn. He was a very focused guy, very driven, huge chip on his shoulder, very Irish, obviously Irish-American. And he did not like the English much.
No. He liked you, though.
But he did. He used to say, and he used to encourage me by saying, you know, for a Limey, you're not a bad bloke. That was the height of accolade from Mark when he said, for a Limey, you're not a bad bloke. And he and I, our driving styles were different, and it was his car.
Yeah.
So he set it up his way. And it was a little bit alarming to start with. The first time I drove it at Sebring in a test, because it had terrific understeer. And I said, Christ, this understeer. He said, yeah, oh yes, I forgot to tell you, it doesn't have a differential, it's got a spool, which means the rear wheels are no differential. So obviously it wants to push out because the rear wheels want to keep going straight on. But, you know, once I got used to it, and I knew what I was doing, I knew why I was doing it, and that was different. So our times were very, very comparable. My only problem was he was a little bit shorter than me. Obviously, in those days, you didn't have all these great adjustable seats and inserts and all that other crap. So my head touched the roof of that 512 a bit, especially somewhere like Sebring where it bounced around. And it was an ideal drive, one of the best drives I've ever had, one of the best teams, one of the best co-drivers, and we never won diddly squat in that car. It's the most iconic 512 out there. Yep. It's the most famous 512.
The tank tape on the front corner. And
front corner, whole bloody car. After Daytona, I mean, we were on the pole at Daytona, just missed the Gulf 917 team off no end. When we arrived, David York and John Horseman just about had a heart attack, which suited me just fine because they had dropped me the year before from driving the 917 after 2 pretty successful years in the GT40. And we were quicker than them, and both of us were quicker than all their guys. And we led easy. And then in the middle of the night, there was a huge crash down on NASCAR 3. And Mark Donahue slowed up, and some guy we'd already lapped about 10 times ran into him and caused all that tank tape, and we came third. We went to Sebring on the pole, leading again, and he and Rodriguez had a coming together.
As they did, yeah.
Right out of the back. And fun enough, in this year's program for the Sebring 12 Hour, just last Saturday, there's a long story in there by Hal Crocker about the 71 Sebring, and he explains what he saw of the accident.
Right. And
it's not exactly how Mark Donahue saw it, but they did run into each other.
That's the racing driver way, though, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you always blame the other guy. I mean, you wouldn't be human if you didn't blame the other guy. Yeah.
There's a line in his book, which has always stood out for me about you, which he said, I made a note of it, he said, he was worried when they signed you, he was worried that you'd be quicker than him, which I think from someone like Mark Donahue is the best compliment that a racing driver could ever give you, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't do better than that.
Especially coming from someone like Mark Donahue.
Yeah, but as I say, he was a bit of a worrier. He worried that some guy was sweeping the floor and Mark, wasn't. Well, he had better things to do with his time, really, but he insisted on doing menial tasks like sweeping the floor. And the fact that year at Sebring, I mean, he insisted on driving the truck down there.
Yeah. Because
he liked driving the truck. Well, Mark, you should be in a plane when you get there, and he hurt his foot actually driving the truck. So, but it's nice to be thought of that way, because the thing is that he and I, the reason I got asked to drive for them was because the year before I'd been doing the Formula 5000, and he and I had some good. Then Roger decided he'd do some Formula 5000 races in the Lola, and the Lola wasn't as good as the Surtees TS5, but he and I had some pretty good races, and we came about even Stevens, and that's how they came to ask me to drive for them in the first place.
Yeah, and that was kind of off the back of a bit of a tricky kind of couple of years for you, because you had the 917 test with the dodgy gearbox, which then sort of lost you that drive as such. And then obviously Honda pulled out of Formula One as well when you were about to have a year.
Yeah.
So that Penske drive was kind of the ideal scenario for you, wasn't it?
It was the ideal scenario because he offered me the 3 500s, the Indy, the Pocono, and the Ontario 500, and I did the Indy 500. Unfortunately, it was my first Indy, and it was sort of easier than I thought. Very daunting, but still not quite as bad as I thought it was going to be because the banking is not really that steep. And I was driving the car that Mark had driven the year before.
Yeah.
He had the new McLaren, the M16, which had the wing and the front wings, and and McLaren had 2, one for Peter Revson, one for Denny Hulme, and then Roger had one for Mark. And we both did literally thousands of miles all through the month without any problems at all. And then for some reason or other, most on Penske light, they put lightweight gears in for the race. And Mark didn't get the pole. Boy, you've never seen anybody look so ticked off when he lost that pole to Peter Revson. Because he was just in the garage being interviewed by all the press saying, oh, great, you got a new track, but it's a way new track record. Because the McLaren was getting on for 10 mile an hour quicker than anything else.
Yeah.
So Allmans comes in and says, oh, you're going to ruin the race, you're going to ruin the racing, that new car, you're going to ban it. Kicking tyres and generally looking ticked off. And Mark thought he got the pole, and while he's talking in the garage, Tom Carnegie, who was the track announcer, you could suddenly hear his voice saying, and there's a new track record. And Mark went from sort of red face to absolutely white. But, I mean, when the race started, he just rollicked off into the distance.
Yeah.
And then the gearbox broke. He parked it down between 3 and 4. In those days, they didn't turn him in. He didn't bother with that safety car crap. He just parked it and walked back. And, about half an hour later, mine broke coming out of turn 4. And I had just stopped for fuel. Now, in those days, those cars held 75 gallons of ethanol. So the difference in handling between full and empty is just absolutely massive. And the car's significantly more sluggish when it's full of fuel. And I'm coming off turn 4, and a guy called Rick Muth is right behind me. Anyway, my car just suddenly makes this awful clattering noise and obviously stops going forward. So I put the clutch in, and I thought the engine had blown. So I'm looking in the mirror thinking, where am I going to park this thing? Because I'm on the outside of the road. I've gone past pit in. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I better just pull down on the grass at turn 1. Now I'm looking in the mirror thinking, now where's old Rick gone? Because he was right there. Anyway, Rick when I slowed up, he'd swerved, hit the wall. And then he came in and clipped me just about by the left rear wheel. And we both spun down the track, and, neither of us were hurt. And then I ran back to the pits across the road. Because, our big fear in those days was fire.
Yep.
And I just filled it up. So I was ready for the off. I didn't judge the distance between myself and turn 4 very well. I must have just temporarily lost my sense of speed. Because when I leapt onto the pit wall, AJ Foyt missed me by about 2 inches. But so that race was over. And then, of course, Penske said to Teddy Mayer, we'll have... And, Mark's car was parked. Mike Mosley comes along an hour later, clips the wall on the outside, spins down, runs into Mark's parked car and sets fire to them both. So Roger had gone from leading. I would have been rookie of the year, and I probably would have finished, 7th, something like that. And he ends up with 2 wrecked cars.
Yep.
So he says to Teddy, well, I'll have 2 of those McLarens. And Teddy said, no, you won't. You'll have 1. You'll replace the one you got, but we're not going to sell you another one. And so Roger said to me, there's really no point us doing Pocono and Ontario because, these new cars are just so much quicker. There's no hope of winning with the old car. So, but we carried on with the Ferrari, and we went to Sebring leading. Next race was Le Mans. We go to Le Mans, and I think we qualified about 4th, which was pretty good because we didn't have a long tail like the 917s.
Yep.
So then on the Friday, Roger says, we need to change the engine. Ferrari have given us a brand new engine. Mark Donahue and Woody Woodard, the chief mechanic, said, no, we're fine with this one. Because all of Roger's engines were blueprinted by Al Bartz out in California. He stripped them all down, rebuilt them, and they were bulletproof. Anyway, Roger, being the boss, won that argument. So they changed the engine, which was not easy in that 512. Put the new on it and lent our engine to NART, North American Racing Team, to put in their 512 for Sam Posey and Tony Damwitz. In the race, we were up to 3rd and looking very, very, very racy. And engine blew up. And Tony Adamowitz and Sam Posey finished 3rd. And when we dropped out at about 8 o'clock or whatever it was at night, we'd already lapped them. So I think coulda, woulda, shoulda, but I mean, we could have won it.
That's quite interesting about the results, and they don't actually reflect the performances in your career all that much. And do you think you've been given an unfair rap by those numbers?
Definitely. But I'm not a lone ranger. I mean, Chris Amon, his numbers just don't add up at all. And that 1971 could have been a fabulous year. Could have won Daytona, Sebring. Let's not say Le Mans. Let's say on the podium for sure. And we would have won the Watkins Glen 6 Hour, and I was the Formula 5000 champion, so it would have been an absolutely outstanding year. As it was pretty satisfactory by winning the Formula 5000 championship, but not the year, not a dream year. Not the sort of year that someone like Derek Bell would have had, because he'd have won all those races, because he's got more jam on him than a slice of toast. But that's life. And on the other hand, I don't think my racing luck was very good, except that I'm still here talking to you about it. And when I think, I really wanted to be a Formula One driver, and when I look at the Formula One drivers who started with me, there was not many of them left by the mid-70s. So maybe it was a good job I didn't get a regular Formula One driver.
You also tested the Honda RA302 after Joe Schlesser had died? I mean, how did you feel jumping into that car knowing that someone had already had a massive...
Well, that's the sort of crazy thing about those days, isn't it? You always jumped in and you thought, well, it's not going to happen to me. And he must have done something wrong, and it must have been his fault in some way, shape or form, although, of course, so many of the accidents were mechanical breakages in those days. But no, I didn't feel any nerves about it in particular. But it was a pretty horrible car because it was all magnesium. And the engine was a V8 air-cooled, and it was hanging off that sort of structure out the back of the rear bulkhead. So it was a real flexible flyer, so you'd change spring rates by enormous amounts. And it didn't make any difference at all because the car just flexed more. But at the same time, of course, they had the monocoque built by Eric Broadley, the Hondola, with the V12 water-cooled engine. Mr. Honda was very keen on air-cooled. He thought air-cooled was the way to go. But that engine was incredibly peaky. I mean, it only revved to about 8.5. And it didn't give any power at all until about 7. So you had no power band, so it was very difficult to drive. And I tested them both at Silverstone a couple of times. And I broke the lap record in the V12 car, which at the time was held by the aforementioned Chris Amon in the Ferrari. Yeah. So the 12 was a quick car. And I went to Monza to do the race with the promise of, 69 regular drive. And unfortunately, the Japanese engineers insisted that I try both cars, so I spent a lot of time in the air-cooled car. Then on Friday, he finally said, well, Friday might have been Saturday, which car do you want to drive? And I said, well, if it's all right by you, I'd prefer to drive the V12. Now, John was on the pole, and I was like 14th. But in the race, I soon started making up. I climbed way up through the field, and then it dropped a valve at about halfway through. Yeah. But that was a pretty good drive. And then the the following year they pulled out to concentrate on the emissions for American cars.
Sounds very familiar. Sounds very familiar.
Yeah, exactly.
But still, to your name, I think you've still got the only Briton to lead a lap on NASCAR at the 500.
Yeah.
Still the only Briton to win Trans Am, so wasn't all
bad. Mind you, leading the Daytona 500 was, of course, a mistake because in those days there were no radios. And when the yellow flag came out, everybody dived in for a pit stop,
right,
except me. So I led a couple of laps while I stayed out.
Was that the 1976 one?
Yeah, 76.
See, that's quite an interesting race because apparently there was a lot of cheating going on at the time. There was always cheating in NASCAR.
Yeah.
We'll know that.
Allegedly,
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. No lawsuits here. But in that one, a lot of people were allegedly running nitrous oxide at the time. I don't know if that's...
Well, I don't know either. I mean, that year I had got some sponsorship from Coca-Cola through a friend of mine called Mike Bailey, and he'd organised some sponsorship for Coke. And they sponsored the 24-hour with the BMW, the CSL, which I drove with Benny Parsons.
Yep.
And part of the deal was I'd drive the CSL with Benny in the 24-hour, and then in the 500, I'd have his backup car. Well, we get around to the 500 because, you just flat out, obviously, those NASCAR cars. And I was lapping about 178 in his old car, and he was lapping about 182 in the new car. And I had this mechanic called Tex, and Tex was not a rocket science tist, and nor was I. So I say to Benny, I'm sort of stuck. I'll get in. Well, of course, guess what speed he does? Same as me, 178. And he kind of washed his hands of it. Said, "Oh well, doesn't want to go any faster." And Tex was sorted out and walked off. But actually, I came 8th in the 100-mile heat. In the there were 125-mile races, then 150 now, but they're 125-mile on Thursday. I actually came 8th, which is pretty good for a rookie. So I started on the 8th row. When the race started on the Sunday, the big race, as we came off turn 4, because it takes a whole lap to get those things up to speed, really. And as we came off turn 4, we're all doing about 180, 175. And, I mean, you're right in the middle. I'm on the 8th row. And you're right in the middle of this pack, and there's dust, and people are scraping the walls, so you can smell burning paint, you can smell burning rubber, and burning everything. Dust, just massive cloud of dust. And you can't see anything. I mean, you're just right in the middle of this mad pack of machinery, which collectively weighs something like, 1,000 tons. And you're all doing 175 mile an hour in this dust. As we came off turn 4, I thought, I'm not sure. This was just a great idea after all.
That's fair, but you still went back to Michigan.
Well, that was amazing, that race at Michigan, because in the 500 the rear roll bar link broke, so suddenly the only bar working was the front bar, so it started to push like push, as the Americans would say, and understeer, as we'd say. Anyway, the right front tire popped going into turn 1. And that was basically my race. It didn't do much damage to the car. It didn't do much damage, but it did enough that Tex couldn't fix it. So later on, got some Coke sponsorship to do the Michigan 400. And I'm driving a guy called Junie Dunleavy, who's out of Richmond, Virginia. And Junie is like something out of an American film about the Deep South. I mean, chewing tobacco, glasses, little old cap on all the time, very small, very southern, hardly understand a word he says. So I don't remember where I qualified, but sort of middle of the pack. And he had a Ford. The other one was a Chev. This is a Ford, and his number 1 driver was Dick Brooks, who's in the 90 car. 90, that's 90 to you and me.
Right.
In the 90 car, so I can't remember what my number was, but anyway, start the race, and I don't understand it. I'm passing people right, left, and centre. Past Benny, past, I don't know what. Suddenly, there I am, 3rd, behind. The only people in front of me are Cale Yarborough and Darrell Waltrip.
Right.
And I'm thinking, wow, this is not as difficult as I thought after all. And coming out of turn 4, I found out how difficult it was because I spun it. And it went round like a top. and it's facing the right direction, slid right into pit lane and stopped in front of the pits. And Junie Donahue looked through the netting. He said, "That's the finest bit of driving I ever seen." I thought, yeah, well, just change the tyres, my good man, and we'll be on our way, you know. Well, when they changed it, that obviously the yellow flags come out, and they changed the tyres, and by the time I get to the end of pit lane, I can realise that the right rear is loose, not done up, so I slowly come round, and that was the beginning of the end. But I'm still humming along, and I'm getting hotter and hotter and hotter and tireder, because that was the year I was supposed to drive the Jag over here for Ralph Broad, the big coupe. Well, of course, we never did anything. It never ran, and we only raced it once. And I didn't have many other drives, so I was not in very good racing form, fit-wise. And those races are hot as hell, those cars, you know, because you got that great big exhaust pipe is right under your feet out of those V8s, and the engine's right in front of the heat in those cars. It's just staggering. And every time I came for a pit stop, I realised that Dick Brooks was out because I couldn't see his car. I said, "Why don't you let Dick take over?" He said, "No, you're doing fine, you're doing fine." I said, "You don't understand. I want to get out." Anyway, I finished the race, and I'm sitting by the truck after just uniform off to the waist, sweating like hell, hair all plastered all over my head. Well, what hair I had left. And old Junie comes up and he says, "Boy," he said, "I thought you was going to win that thing." I said, "Well, thank you very much, Junie." And that was my last NASCAR race.
Excellent. We are rapidly running out of time, unfortunately.
Oh,
but we do have lots of questions from readers. One from Rob Morris simply says, "Thanks for all your years of commentary in the US." So that's quite nice from Rob Morris. Yeah. Greg Ricks also asked to tell us more about Buffet Benny, which I guess is Benny Parsons.
Yes, well, I didn't know Benny very well, but he had got a bit of a reputation for eating and doing a lot of barbecuing, you know, and he'd have all his secret recipes, which is really just something you go and buy at, not Sainsbury's, but, you know, Winn-Dixie or whatever. But, yeah, he had a bit of a reputation. But he was a big guy, but he was not. I didn't think Buffet Benny was a very fair description of him, really. And he was pretty good. I mean, in the CSL, his big thing, he didn't know how to heel and toe, so his downshifts, you know, just put it into the next gear and let the clutch out again. And so, but he was not. I mean, he wasn't that much off the pace.
He learned a lot at the 24 hours, didn't he?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we both. Unfortunately, that was the year where they got the water in the fuel, and we suffered from it terribly, and we stopped out on the track, and oh God, it was awful. But
Fulvio Balabeo said, basically, thanks for helping him at Skip Barber once. You spent a lot of time at Skip Barber while he was there, apparently.
Oh, did I?
And you made an impression on him, cemented him as a Hobbs fan. So
Fulvio, send money, any amount you like.
So you're basically the reason he loves the sport. So,
good.
Which is quite nice.
Well, there's been quite a bit of that in America with the Formula One. We've been doing Formula One 20 years, about 40 years for me, but. And a lot of guys come up to me and say, the only reason I can watch Formula One on TV is because my wife likes you, so therefore we can watch.
No shame in that.
No.
And similarly, Douglas Meese says, you pushed his Honda S800 when he couldn't start it once at the 1990 BMW Vintage Festival. And that's another thanks. So.
Well, he can send money too.
Yeah.
That's why my knees are so bad. Yeah. Pushing his car.
But, serious question this time from Stevie Mitchell. About 1973 Can-Am, when you were in the Roy Woods M20. And I think you said that was, from what I could see on our archive, you're the only time you had a good car for Can-Am. But the way I see that is kind of taking a knife to a gunfight almost, when you're there in that, and then you've got Mark Donahue in his 917, just with twice as much power as.
Well, one of the best drives I think I ever had was the Watkins Glen Can-Am in that M20. Now, the year before, I'd driven the Lotus T310, which was just awful. And I just can't say enough bad about that car and that year. It was such a disappointment, finally driving the factory Lola. And it was horrible. So the following year, Roy Woods has got this incredible windfall of money from Carling Black Label and wants me to drive the Can-Am car. And he buys the M20, which had been Revson's car the year before.
Right. And
it was one of the best cars I've ever driven. I mean, it was so terrific. The only trouble was it was about 300 horsepower down.
Yep.
But at Watkins Glen, I came second to Mark Donahue on the same lap in the 9:17.10:30.
Yep.
And I beat all the other 917s, turbo 917s, and there was probably 8 or 9 of them. Hurley Hayward, Peter Gregg, Brian, Jody Scheckter. A lot of good cars, a lot of good drivers. George Fulmer, and that car was just peachy to drive.
Yeah.
But as you say, at that stage, it was already like taking a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah, I guess the circuit probably helped being a twisty, tight.
Yeah,
it must have been quite horrible for them to drive with such a big turbo.
The 917, the 1030 was good because it has slightly long wheelbase. The others were a bit short wheelbase for such a powerful engine, and such an engine that came on with such a huge surge of power towards the end. So not the easiest car to drive.
No. A question from Stephen Gate. Would you say you ever drove the ultimate perfect lap? If so, when and where? Would that have been that weekend?
Well, I suppose that would have been as good as any. Another good lap I drove was the last lap in the Formula Junior race at Silverstone in 1963, in what would have been the May meeting, duking it out with Denny Hulme in the Brabham, and the gear shift knob broke off my car with about 5 laps to go. Here's another woulda, coulda, shoulda. And I sussed it out, and I was changing up with my thumb and down with my finger. Could just about that much lever sticking up above the gate. And on the last lap, I broke the lap record, and Denny and I had changed positions quite a few times, and I knew I could beat him because I knew where his weak spots were. And then obviously when it broke off, I dropped back a little bit because it was a bit disconcerting, and I caught him up on the last lap, and we crossed the line just a few feet apart, and I broke the lap record on the last lap, so that would have been a pretty good lap.
Yeah, that's been quite a field Formula Junior in 1963.
Huge. I mean, there are probably 40 cars in it.
Yeah. And
you had Peter Handel, Mike Spence, Richard Atwood, Bill Bradley, Paul Hawkins, Frank Gardner.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty well anybody who was anybody. And me and Denny were like 10 seconds clear of the field.
Yeah.
It was one of those races that shouldn't happen.
Was that your debut season in Formula Junior?
Yeah. Would be my 4th race. Only my 5th single-seater race. Because before that, I'd driven like Mum's Morris, Dad's Jag, the Elite. It wasn't. And in fact, in 1962, I went back to Nürburgring with Richard Atwood. He drove my Elite with me. And Richard had done racing the proper way. I mean, his dad bought him a car, bought him a proper car, a racing car, bought him a Cooper, BMC, Formula Junior, and they formed Midland Racing Partnership. And he said, well, I'm driving for you at Nürburgring. I'll let you drive my car somewhere in the season. So in August, the opportunity came up, so I drove his car at Alton Park. And a guy called Keith Francis was the king of Alton Park in those days. And John Fenning was pretty useful and everybody thought, well, you might come in the top 5. And I won the race. So I won my first ever single-seater race.
Wow.
And I thought then, oh boy, this is the way to go. This is, you don't have all that metal around you. This is fantastic. So.
Yeah. Speaking of single-seaters and good days, Anthony Jenkins, regular listener and reader, has said, I'm old enough to fondly remember you in Continental Formula A. Was Sam Posey ever your equal or better on track or in verbal repartee?
Well, he's certainly a better writer than I am. And he and I are about equal on the talking capability. I pretty much always beat Sam, so and I think he'd be the first to admit it, that because he was the king of Lime Rock, and the very first time I raced, because he lived there, and the first time I went to Lime Rock, I beat him, so he's had to swallow that.
I see in your book you did add him in your list of best co-drivers. So
yeah,
was that?
Well, he wrote the forward
courtesy,
to the book too. So, yeah.
Because your rivalry was kind of hammed up a little bit, you said.
Oh, very much so, yeah. It was hammed up by, yes, very much by the PR firm that Rod Campbell, who ultimately became PR boss for Ford, and has done very well. And Rod Campbell is Townsend Bell's father-in-law.
Right.
And Rod was a terrific promoter. And he dragged me and Sam all over the country to promote the Formula 5000 Championship in the mid-'60s.
Like boxers, like boxers, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, he'd take us to, if the race was going to be at Laguna Seca, he'd take us to Monterey and to San Francisco and maybe down to Los Angeles. And if it was at Sears Point, we'd go to Sacramento, and but he did all the PR. And we were the only two guys he ever used.
Right.
And we'd be doing TV and local stations and newspapers.
Yeah.
So
so to wrap up, like now, you obviously spent longer as a broadcaster now, I believe, than you did as a racing driver. So
I did. I raced for 30 years, and I've been broadcasting for 40. Now, obviously, some of those years overlap. 10 years of overlap. But I've enjoyed the broadcasting. It's come to a bit of a grinding halt now with the moving from NBC to ESPN for the Formula One. But I've had a good career. Can't complain. And as I say, my racing luck was not the best, but generally speaking, I've had a pretty lucky life.
Yeah.
Met some good people. Had Margaret as my companion for my entire life, practically.
Yep.
And had a pretty lucky lot most of the time.
Yeah, and it's all wrapped up in your brand new book, which I believe we will be selling on our shop as well. So
I sincerely hope you'll be selling it in your shop.
If you do want a copy of the book, head to Motorsport Magazine's website and you'll be able to pick it up there. Thank you, David, for coming over. And thank you for an excellent hour or so. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Alan, for making us sound great as ever. If you enjoyed that, do share, tell your friends, comment, let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and we'll be back soon, I believe, with your good friend Derek Bell.
Oh my God, he's always there. It's like a nightmare. Him and Brian Redmond are like sort of nightmare around my neck all the time.
We'll let them know for you. So, thanks. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.